Hi, everyone.
Amazing. Looks
Welcome.
like we just hit start. Sorry, Ben. Go for it.
No, you're all good. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on on the overview of the greenhouse gas assurance process. We'll give people just a minute or two to join in the call. In the meantime, feel free to let us know where you're calling in from in the chat, and we'll get started in just a second. For everyone on this call, I'm calling in from the Amsterdam area. A little bit rainy out today, but not bad weather for a GHG assurance chat.
Ben, do you think rainy is good for GHG assurance? If it's too sunny, it feels like a topic that's not appropriate for a beautiful day.
No, too sunny. I feel like greenhouse gas assurance is more of a fall winter activity, not quite spring summer.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's probably part of our conversation. We're jumping the gun, but it is kind of a summer activity for a lot of companies that are on
It is
a
true.
traditional calendar year.
It, if you're getting it in for CDP, it is certainly a July August
A little bit of
activity.
a, yeah. Not that it's necessarily the most thrilling, but I guess it is today because that's what brings us all together. Looks like we have a couple people still trickling in, and we could just give it one more minute here before we get going.
Yeah, sounds good to me. Hope everyone's enjoying their summertime. I know August is a slower time in the office as well, so while your colleagues are out on holiday, you can listen to this riveting presentation we have prepared for you.
I feel like Ben, when we say riveting without having talked at all, it maybe may call into question our sanity. But no, hopefully this is actually going to be pretty interesting. We've done a good amount of assurance processes, of course, and tried to collapse that information into a couple of those key takeaways, and give you a couple real world examples throughout the call today. Just last bit of housekeeping, and then we can get started. Of course, this is currently being recorded. We welcome as many questions as you have. Please put those in the chat, and we'll get to them a little bit more at the end. And if you do have any questions or want to follow ups, then we're here to be helpful. But hopefully, a lot of them will be answered throughout the course of the content today. I think we've reached quorum. So Ben, maybe we can kick it off.
Yeah, ready for it. Um, and so, hello everyone. My name is Ben. I am the team lead for greenhouse gas accounting for the APAC and EMEA region for Green Project Technologies. I'm joined today by my wonderful boss, Bennett, who is our Chief Customer Success Officer, and we are going to walk you through the greenhouse gas assurance process. And so the first question you're probably wondering is what actually is greenhouse gas assurance? Assurance for greenhouse gas emissions is a process where the calculations and data behind your reported emissions totals are verified by a third party in order to ensure and confirm the accuracy of the calculations. Essentially an outside team comes in, checks your data, queries a set of samples across your footprint, and verifies that the data inputs, calculations, methodologies, et cetera, behind your GHG totals are in fact what you say they are. In addition, if you've calculated a greenhouse gas footprint before, they're also going to evaluate any year-over-year trends at a scope category level to ensure that increases or decreases in your overall footprint make sense. You can think of the process much like a financial audit, but a little bit less intense because you're not dealing with the 10K and obviously focused on environmental data instead. Um, with greenhouse gas assurance, there are two different levels. So you can either get limited or reasonable assurance. The names kind of speak for themselves, but the main difference is essentially the number of data points that are going to be queried throughout the process. With limited assurance, a smaller set of metrics are going to be tested for verification, where with reasonable assurance, you can expect a lot more queries into the data. And just to talk technical standards for a quick second, when you engage in a greenhouse gas assurance process, you're going to be following a standard like ISAE 3410 or most commonly ISO 1464-3, which are the two standards that basically every assurance provider in the space is using to govern the process. Also, worth noting is that you can get assurance on your entire scope 1 through 3 greenhouse gas footprint the first time, or just specific categories. So, for example, many companies begin by getting limited assurance on only their scope 1 and 2 inventory, and then expand into scope 3 assurance year over year. Uh, because the success of the assurance process hinges on data inputs being traceable and verifiable, Companies generally don't get assurance until their GHG footprints are a little bit more robust and built out. Not to scare you or say that your footprint has to be 100% airtight in order to engage in the process. Just to note that, for example, if you're estimating really heavily across your greenhouse gas footprint, if raw data sources are hard to trace down, or if you don't know the exact stakeholders that are involved in the data collection process, greenhouse gas assurance is going to be a bit more cumbersome and certainly more time consuming. And, that's the basics on what greenhouse gas assurance is. Now, why would you seek it? Of course, the process can be pretty time consuming as well as costly depending on the scope of the engagement. But assurance offers companies a lot of benefits when it comes to reporting, including credibility writ large, and it can better set you up for, measuring year over year emissions reductions and just tracking your footprint in a consistent manner over time. Depending on the size and location of your company, it may also be a requirement. And so, for example, companies subject to reporting under CSRD, California's SB 253, New Zealand or Australia's climate regulations may be required to get at least limited assurance on scope 1 and 2 emissions. The same is going to be true for any companies operating in countries who plan on adopting ISSB standards some point in the future. The exact requirements of each of these standards depends a lot on the size, location, and sector of the company. But these regulations at least require limited assurance on scope 1 and 2 emissions for the first cycle of mandatory reporters. And generally speaking, this is again very large companies and publicly listed companies. However, the regulations are expected to increase in scope over time, where smaller companies may eventually be subject to the same limited assurance requirements as larger companies. And candidly, I think we both all know at this point we have no idea how the final regulations like CSRD are going to shake out. Thus, it's always good to be prepared, in our opinion. However, outside of requirements, and honestly, in my opinion, probably the main driver of greenhouse gas assurance at this point is it can help bolster your credibility in the space and improve your performance score on several non-mandatory but universally accepted frameworks. For example, CDP, the Climate Disclosure Project, offers a boost in your score if you get at least limited assurance on your scope 1 and 2 emissions. And the Science-Based Target Initiative, which I'm sure everyone on this call has heard of, is planning to require at least limited assurance on your base year and annual emissions performance reporting in version 2 of their standard, which is slated to become active in 2027. In addition, other non-mandatory frameworks like TCFD, EDCI, et cetera, if you're in private equity, encourage companies to get at least limited assurance as a best practice. And even outside of both, requirements and voluntary frameworks, going through an assurance process can help companies improve their GHG calculation processes, data collection and target setting procedures in the aggregate. For example, the process itself can certainly help you, one, identify areas that need the most data quality improvement. It can increase greenhouse gas footprint traceability. And it really, in my opinion, the biggest one is it helps companies ensure consistent reporting methodologies are used year over year to further help you set accurate baselines against any, emissions reduction targets you have, as well as when you engage with any of these voluntary frameworks that can be a bit stringent about your year over year emissions, like, for example, SBTi.
So we talked a little bit about, what is GHG assurance. Also, Ben just reviewed why it's important. I want to just chime in with a couple thoughts on, okay, we know it's something we want to do. What do we need to do to prep before that process? And this is from a couple different perspectives. It's, of course, as practitioners, the people that are in charge of actually executing and securing that assurance, but it's also in terms of how can you have internal stakeholder alignment, run it up to your C-suite, because this isn't a decision that's very commonly, although sometimes it can be, but very commonly made in isolation. Making sure that you have buy-in and that you're going in eyes wide open to what an assurance process looks like is really key. So there's a couple main points. First is data quality here. So Ben's hinted at this. Just to reemphasize the point, the entire purpose of engaging in limited or reasonable assurance is to ensure that your environmental data is accurate. So Auditors are going to be coming in and they're going to be expecting traceability. They're going to be expecting documentation for backing up your numbers, whether that's a utility invoice that they'll ask for as proof. Particularly, they're likely to ask for that if they see high consumption that's perhaps anomalous in a certain region. Sometimes we've had auditors that ask for invoices for purchased goods and services. That's not the most common, but it is a valid request to make sure that the actual invoice is flowing through to your financial accounting, is flowing through to your carbon accounting. Very commonly, if you're looking at some of your Scope 3 data, they'll ask for your travel logs to understand what was that origin and destination of a flight. How is that then flowing through to an emissions factor that you're using in the inventory? It's imperative going into this then that your environmental data is at a minimum, is pretty well organized and documented. The auditor is going to force you to get better. And if this is the first time you're doing an audit, maybe you're doing a pre-audit readiness assessment with an auditor. I will say that they're often here to help you, and their interests do align with your interests in making sure that you have your data as organized as possible in order to make that assurance process easier for them. But it is worth thinking that while it doesn't have to be perfect, we do recommend that you have a robust process in place before looping in an additional third party to the engagement. Part of that is because you don't want to waste this opportunity. It's a little bit costly. Greenhouse gas assurance is carried out by a organization that is separate from the provider that is helping you with your inventory. So, green projects helping you with your inventory, we wouldn't be able to provide assurance. Similarly, KPMG, if they are doing your assurance process, they would not be able to do your inventory. It is a third party for this. And depending on the level of robustness for that assurance exercise, as well as then the reputation of the firm that you're working with. If we're going with one of the big four accounting firms, it's probably going to be a slightly larger check than a few of the more niche environmental accounting companies out there. We do have a list of recommended assurance providers if everyone is at the point of trying to understand where their money is best spent and the different packages that different assurers might offer. There's going to be a cost attached to this, ranges from low, probably tens of thousands to we worked with a company that has 500 sites globally, is one of the largest private firms out there, and they're paying almost $250,000 for assurance at the most robust level. I don't mean to scare people with numbers. Very commonly you can start an assurance process for right around 10,000, but this is an additional financial commitment, and let alone the financial commitment, there's a time commitment attached to this. You're going to need to have your greenhouse gas inventory in a place where it's ready for insurance. Ideally, we've helped you put together an inventory management plan, a methodology document. That's all the preparatory work, let alone then once we get into the assurance process, being able to be responsive quickly to any of the queries that are coming in from your auditors. Maybe they're asking you for that natural gas bill or providing that invoice, checking the emissions factors, the conversions factors, the sources. This is where having a partner is a great way to take that burden a little bit off of you and your team. But to be blunt, there's still going to be a burden for helping manage that communication and working together in order to be as responsive as quickly as possible to those assurance providers. You don't want to hold up the process, and you don't want them to spend more time and potentially charge you more than they need to in order to write that letter. So not to beat a dead horse or anything here, but we're definitely talking about the ways that you can get your data ready for that assurance process. That's probably the most effective thing that you can do going into any of these engagements. So Ben, why don't I pass it off to you to talk a little bit more specifically about how to ensure that your data is audit ready here?
Yeah, of course, Bennett. And so I'm sure for many people listening on this call, you're probably wondering, is my data audit ready? Honestly, Likely, probably. I think a lot of you probably have GHG inventories in a place where you could engage in assurance, especially for scope one and two. For scope one and two, the expectation is that you're using primary utility bill data at least as much as possible. Though if you're estimating some utility data, as long as you have a documented methodology that's reasonable and can be backed up academically, you should be fine. Just to harp on that backed up academically note real quick, assurance providers do like to see that you have at least cited studies or legitimate sources regarding any estimation methodologies that you're using. So I just don't take the first random thing off of Google. Make sure that it's vetted and approved. For scope three, the expectation is the same, but there are no requirements to use spend-based, distance-based, PCF product carbon footprint-based data. You can use whatever is the easiest for your company, as well as whatever you've decided to include in your GHG footprint, as long as it's aligned with the GHG protocol. For example, if you use Navan to track your business travel, ensure that data has been accurately transcribed into the greenhouse gas footprint. If you have logistics providers like, for example, FedEx and DHL that report CO2e totals directly to you, make sure that you have access to the methodology behind the numbers and the emissions factors because the auditors will ask. Without going into the weeds, because scope 3 data can vary so widely, again, I'll repeat this multiple times throughout the rest of this presentation, traceability is by far the most important part. For listeners where the above might not be the case or are worried about your data quality, I would recommend that before you engage in assurance, you do a couple of things. Step one is, have a clean and mapped facility list and access to primary utility data for your utilities. I know that seems like a no-brainer, but you would be surprised how many large companies don't actually have that clean of lists before they start, greenhouse gas footprints. Two, identify the stakeholders that have ownership over the data so that you know who to contact if you need to follow up and grab additional source data files. This will save you a lot of time down the road. Thirdly, focus on your material categories and don't get too bogged down on categories that are very immaterial to your overall footprint. For example, if your employee commuting emissions are 2% of your entire footprint, but purchase goods and services is 75%, you can bet that assurance providers are going to ask a lot more questions about purchase goods and services than they are employee commuting. Focusing on accurate calculations for the largest contributing GHG categories will set you up well for the process. In addition, I highly recommend that you build out a greenhouse gas methodology document in line with the GHG protocol that details, specific data sources, any estimation methodologies, calculation procedures being used, and the overall process behind your GHG calculations. Basically, having a written version of whatever Excel or platform-based greenhouse gas footprint that you deliver will really help the auditors get an understanding of what's been included. And also, lastly, and very important, honestly, avoid using non-traceable tools to calculate your greenhouse gas footprint. For example, online calculators that don't back up or publish their methodology or emissions factors that are not part of publicly vetted data sets. I think some people on this call probably remember, the Qantas Scope 3 evaluator tool that was very popular a couple of years ago, where you plug in a spend value and it spits out an emissions total. That was, industry best practice and used widely a couple years ago. Now, for example, a tool like that is not assurance grade. And to go into what the actual process looks like step by step, it's the same for pretty much every single company. Really, the extent of the engagement is up to you depending on how many categories you're getting assured. The first step is going to be, having an initial kickoff call with your assurance provider. On this call, they're going to go over the timeline, the expectations, and scope of the engagement. Is it scope 1 and 2, scope 1 through 3, etc. And prior to this call, they're going to ask you to supply them with several files, including, your GHG footprint and other relevant methodology documents. Here to note too, when I say supply our GHG footprint, it's not necessarily totals. They want to see, line by line, line item detail that's been included. The second step is when you're actually going to receive the first set of sample queries, where assurance providers, after evaluating your greenhouse gas footprint, are going to identify the data points that they want to further investigate. Often, the first data points queried are the ones that have the greatest contribution to your greenhouse gas footprint, but several will be random as well, just for general QA/QC. You'll need here to provide documentation to support these data points, such as utility bills, invoices, travel log data, etc. For example, as Bennett mentioned, they might say provide, a utility bill to support the natural gas usage at X manufacturing facility, or provide your employee commuting survey in order to back up the distances that you've included in your scope 3.7. Um, Also to note here is that if you've calculated a greenhouse gas footprint before, they're also going to ask you about year-over-year trends. This won't be relevant if it's the first time you've ever calculated a greenhouse gas footprint, or if you're using this footprint as your base year. There's no need to do it. But if you've reported greenhouse gas emissions for several years, they're really going to look into any year-over-year trends and are certainly going to ask for reasoning behind any increases or decreases by category level that maybe exceed 5 to 10%. For example, if your scope 2 emissions increased 50% year over year, they're going to want to know why. Maybe you opened several new facilities. Maybe you installed a ton of very, power intensive equipment. Whatever the reason, you'll need to state it and defend it in order to, make those year over year trends seem reasonable. Step 3 is when the auditors are going to actually evaluate your responses, and continue to ask questions as needed. Again, the more mistakes that are identified, the more queries that are asked. And it's not uncommon at all for companies to produce several iterations of a greenhouse gas footprint before assurance is finalized and a certificate's given. Any responses you send are going to be tracked into query logs set by your assurance provider. It's going to remain active throughout the process, and essentially you'll probably see, a dynamic data validation tab that either has closed or opened each query. Once every single query has been closed, then you're done with this process, and they're going to open more the more mistakes they find. The final step is when you'll actually receive the issuance of an assurance statement once the auditors are satisfied. This is going to prove that you finally completed the process. This certificate is what you can use, for example, in your company sustainability report, or as documentation when reporting to CDP or SBTi to prove that you've completed the process. To give you an idea of timeline, and I will note that it does vary, of course, depending on the complexity of the company, an average limited assurance assessment, I would say, takes 3 to 6 weeks, where reasonable assurance can stretch longer. Again, it really depends on your company complexity, because, for example, if you have 1 or 2 facilities and you're only getting scope 1 and 2 assurance, it's not going to take 6 weeks. But if you have, hundreds of global facilities, it's certainly going to take a little bit longer. And we can hop into some actual real world examples here. As a greenhouse gas accountant for the past couple of years, I've had the opportunity to support several assurance engagements, and I've seen companies both excel and struggle a little bit more than others throughout the process. To start with an anecdotal example of, companies that struggle, or maybe that's not the right word, just have a little bit more of an onerous experience. I worked with one company that operated globally but collected data regionally, by country level. This meant that, when queries, for example, about business travel were asked across several countries, several different stakeholders had to be contacted in order to provide, the supporting documentation. It goes without saying, emailing half a dozen data owners across global time zones is, of course, more complex and time consuming than having a centralized system to turn to. Where their assurance process, it just took longer than most, simply because of the number of stakeholders that needed to be contacted and the response times therein. Because when you do respond to queries, if you're looking for source data, obviously, the longer it takes for you to respond to an open query given by an assurance provider, the longer the process is going to take to close out. To turn to a little bit more of a positive one, I also worked with another company that centralized their systems and was able to provide supporting documentation, much faster through a travel management software. Here, when data points were queried, it was very fast to turn back, to a centralized file and provide information that the auditors were looking for. For example, in auditor queries, I want to see documentation behind flight XYZ that flew from A to B. If you have a centralized system, you pop right into it, you search up, the flight ID log, or, whatever unique identifier you're using, you pull down the invoice immediately, and then you can close out the query pretty fast. I also do want to mention utility data here, just because for many companies, if not most companies, this is going to be the biggest focus of the assurance engagement, and maybe the only focus if you're only doing scope 1 and 2 assurance. I've worked with companies that have centralized utility tracking systems and companies that have stored, unlabeled PDFs in foreign languages. And let me tell you, I think utility bills are always the biggest issue when it comes to assurance. Auditors want to see that the amount of kilowatt hours, CCF of natural gas, whatever resource we're talking about, matches exactly what the utility bill says. Thus, in my opinion, having a centralized software or a person whose job it is to, log, track, and manage utility bills by facility over the course of a year is pretty critical for a successful assurance engagement. And because here's where, in my opinion, it can kind of create a domino effect sometime where if they find one utility bill that was logged incorrectly, maybe you took peak kilowatt hours instead of total kilowatt hours used by a facility, and then you realize that you made that mistake across an entire set of PDF bills. That's when, it doesn't necessarily stop the assurance process. It's just you're doing very major recalculations now rather than doing minor corrections or just, proving that the data you included in the first place was correct. And further to talk about that domino process, some people are probably wondering, can you actually fail greenhouse gas assurance? The answer is yes, but it is certainly very, very rare. Failing assurance really only happens if auditors are not comfortable with the methodology and data points you're using across the entire greenhouse gas footprint. As long as you're tracking data accurately and following the greenhouse gas protocol, you should be fine. When auditors find mistakes, you're allowed and supposed to correct them. As Bennett mentioned, this is a process to improve your GHG, calculation methodology. And generally speaking, this won't have any effect on your ability to get assurance, just how long it takes, and furthermore, how much it might cost overall. The entire point of this is improving accuracy. And if they find hundreds of mistakes that amount to really, really material increases or decreases across your greenhouse gas footprint, it might be an issue. But correcting several data points across a greenhouse gas footprint is not only common, it's really expected. There have been companies that have failed the assurance process, but I personally have not seen it occur. And if you don't pass, unless you're subject to mandatory reporting requirements, there aren't really any immediate consequences except for, potentially losing money on the engagement and not being able to add an assurance statement to, your CDP disclosure, et cetera. If you're concerned about the data quality of your greenhouse gas footprint, you can always engage in what's called an assurance readiness assessment before you engage in the actual process, where you'll essentially go through, a mock version of assurance with the team and work with auditors to identify any areas that you need to improve before you actually engage officially.
Thanks, Ben. I'm going to chime in to talk a little bit about what's coming next because assurance, obviously, we're having this webinar. It's something that a lot of our clients are talking more and more about. And there's a couple of reasons. There is regulation. We led with that at the top of this webinar. So SB 253, for example, requiring limited assurance starting with your scope 1, scope 2 in the United States, pushing a lot of companies towards assurance. Even those that thought they might have it out because the SEC rule that would have required broader assurance was canceled. A lot of scope 3 assurance is kicking in later in the decade. So we have some clients that are starting to think about getting scope 3 assurance even prior to that point, because as Ben said, year over year, this does tend to get a little bit easier. But even putting aside the regulatory world, we do see the measurement milestones 2030, 2035, 2050. As we get closer to those milestones, voluntary frameworks are evaluating more rigorously the claims that companies are making. So previously, we lived in a world where anyone could say we have a science-based target. It's looking like in the future, getting greenhouse gas assurance will be part of bolstering the credibility of that claim, allowing you to avoid any greenwashing concerns, and just building that trust both internally at your company and externally in the validity of your footprint. We're also seeing a big shift towards GHG data collection for commercial reasons. To phrase that slightly differently, your clients may be asking you for your emissions inventory. And some of the large corporates that we work with that are requesting this data from their suppliers either require a consultant's letter from a provider like the Green Project, or if you're calculating your inventory, perhaps with an internal team, they require that you have third-party assurance. We expect that to only increase because your data is their data, and translating it into their footprint, their auditors are going to make sure that your footprint that's potentially generating an emissions factor for them as a supplier is as accurate as possible. So it's kind of this cycle of assurance and credibility, and the more common it becomes, the more conversations certainly like these that we will have. But we do expect it to become, not necessarily for everyone, but certainly for larger and especially public companies, best practice moving forward. And that leads us to a couple bits around how Green Project can help. So a lot of our webinar today has been slightly more broad around assurance process. Green Project, we've designed our platform and our team to make this really as easy for you as possible. Built as one of the first audit grade carbon accounting platforms out there. That means a few things to us. It means we're going to give you the technology, but also your sustainability manager to support you through an assurance process. So an end-to-end audit trail designed with several of our assurance partners, going to be incredibly transparent into any unit conversions, any estimations, any emissions factors, basically all of that math that we were talking about earlier that auditors want to be able to trace out. We're going to give that to them in a really clean Excel file. We were talking about the struggle to come up with some documentation. Not that you necessarily have to load in everything preemptively, but we do have a document library built into our platform whereby you can associate files with every single line item that ends up in that audit trail. It's a really clean way to understand and link information from that actual invoice to the calculation that the auditor is reviewing. We want to make it as traceable for you as possible. And we're going to have audit grade data quality checks directly in the platform. You'll make sure that we are fact checking all of our work, both automated as well as with those manual reviews by your sustainability manager team. That's a focus on the platform, but we do also offer additional audit support, ranging from creating those inventory management plans, creating potentially even a publishable version of a methodology report, and complete coaching through that assurance process. We have a 100% track record of getting our clients through assurance, often with a smile on your face. So, and every intent to continue that track record. So if this is becoming a priority for you, you're not currently working with us, definitely encourage reaching out to our team. We'll just put a link in the chat to book a meeting and describe how potentially we could support you on that journey. So this brings us to the part of our conversation where Ben and I have run out of prepared materials, and we are more than happy to give a little bit of time back. But I actually do see that there have been a couple questions submitted. We can run through those. Ben, have you had a chance to look at the Q&A yet? Do you want to answer the first question here?
Yeah, certainly. I'll answer the first two kind of in one. This is about, so one, is a company expected to correct all identified errors by an assurance provider, even those that fall below the de minimis threshold? And the second part is, how do assurance providers set de minimis thresholds? Is it common that assurance providers don't actually share the materiality threshold for sustainability assurance? The first part of this question, I would say, generally speaking, writ large, I've seen a 5% de minimis threshold set by, auditors, assurance providers. Writ large, this usually matches any baseline recalculation policies, recommended language in the GHG protocol and SBTi as well. And this is to say, for example, I worked with a company where they calculated fugitive emissions associated with their air conditioners as well as a small office kitchen in their very large facilities. The fugitive emissions were maybe 0.5% of the entire footprint and thus weren't really queried or a focus of the assurance process at all. However, the second part of the question, I would say yes, you are expected to correct all errors identified, even if a single error falls below that de minimis threshold. The reason being that, for example, if you log one flight incorrectly, it certainly isn't going to affect your entire GHG footprint more than 5%, more than likely. But the idea of assurance is that if they're continually finding mistakes, potentially there are nested mistakes within that footprint that would add up to more than 5%. And so, generally speaking, every single query that is opened by an auditor is going to have to be closed.
It's also because you don't really want them to publicly disclose that as a finding, that there were a couple, issues that weren't fixed. I suppose you could get away with that. But this is a document that for the assurance findings that you want to be able to share. So having it as clean as possible is just in your interest here. 5% total emissions is normally the approach, although and that can vary if you're not seeking assurance on your total footprint, right? And then it would be by category.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, honestly, it also depends on like any internal baseline recalculation policies that you've built out. So I've seen companies say, our de minimis threshold is 5% across the entire footprint. Or I've seen companies say we're only getting assurance on business travel this year. Our threshold for recalculation is 5% of that category of emissions specifically.
Yeah, this is one of the fun parts of the GGP where it's slightly gray area. And it really is, I guess, a little bit up for you to define it in your inventory management plan. Auditors will recommend 5%, but that isn't actually written down anywhere as a required rule. So a little bit open to interpretation. Another question came in here on an example of a validation check that an auditor might expect over third-party information. So if you get a calculated emission from a third party, potentially in this question, somebody who manages recycled products that then they refurbish, what would an auditor expect to see? The most common example of this is, as Ben was mentioning earlier, FedEx for logistics or a travel management platform that's doing their own calculation. Ben, do you want to comment a little bit on what we've provided to auditors in the past for some evidence there?
Yeah, certainly. And I will say, I think a lot of the bigger providers in this space, like the DHLs and FedExes, have gotten these requests a lot. So generally speaking, I've seen companies receive both like a PDF report as well as an Excel that lists out the methodology with the minimum requirements for an assurance provider to look at. But things they're going to be checking are, for example, are the global warming potentials of the emissions factors used in your calculations uniform across the board? Is there documentation that, AR5 values or AR6 values, whatever you're normalizing your footprint to, were used? In addition, the travel softwares can be interesting to work with. And I will say a lot of times what we'll do is we'll take the raw distances from travel management softwares and actually recalculate the emissions ourselves, only because there can be nuances around like I said, the global warming potentials of the emissions factors, how you're classifying, long haul, medium haul, short haul. Are you using DEFRA emissions factors for global regions? Are you using US EPA emissions factors for global regions? And so oftentimes there are a lot more nuances than you'd think when it comes to the travel management softwares, but really they're looking for emissions factor sources and consistency across the footprint.
And I think this is just to drive home the point. This is the complexity behind the scenes, making sure that you have that AR alignment in your emissions factors. Most people don't even know what your AR report is. Making sure that you have GHG disaggregation where appropriate. These are all different questions that others are going to ask. Again, it's things that we've spent a ton of time thinking about at Green Project, sort of that behind the scenes magic for how you get that audit report at the end of the day, because it's a lot of work that's going into just one headline number for your overall carbon footprint here. Couple other good questions here. I think this is just a quick one, Ben. Differences between greenhouse gas assurance versus, I believe this is third-party verification. So GHG assurance would be a form of third-party verification. Assurance is definitionally done by a third party. So in this sense, I think they're largely synonymous. Anything to add on to that one, Ben?
No, I would say you got that one, Bennett.
Okay. And then this is an interesting question from Alfonso around blockchain. So some data is provided via blockchain. How do you manage data provided this way? And I mean, to be perfectly honest, Alfonso, it sounds like you're a little on the cutting edge here. Most companies are not documenting in a ledger, their data sources here via blockchain. I'm sure it is a great form of evidence depending on the data set. We've seen it a little bit more for transportation or purchase goods and services than something perhaps more common like utilities. So it's perhaps a little bit more scope 3 shifted. But just like any other form of verification, it's making sure that you can explain it to an auditor and that you can share that ledger with them to make sure that they have complete visibility into the line of transacted events that go into the footprint. Ben, any other blockchain commentary from you?
No, I think you got that one pretty well, pretty good as well, Bennett.
Okay, well, let me toss this last question that we have so far to you, although, I mean, keep them coming. This is great to see the engagement from the team here. We get a question that's around challenges in obtaining data. So the company is finding it challenging to close the gap to the auditors flagged for last year's sustainability report. Going into this year's assurance cycle, how do you think that should be proactively managed?
Yeah, in that case, I would recommend, it sounds like the data gap is only going to be closed through estimations. If it's impossible to obtain, it's impossible to obtain. And I will say that it is common for companies to, example, use as much primary data as possible and then close data gaps with estimations. For example, let's say your company's trying to get greenhouse gas assurance by the end of August, but you simply have not received utility bills for July by the end of August. There's nothing you can do other than estimate that data. I would just say make sure that estimate it in line with the volume of data that you've received. Ensure you build out a standard process that you can repeat year over year, especially if you're assuming that this data gap is going to be consistently there. And I don't know exactly what the data gap is referring to specifically. Whether it's in business travel, whether it's in utility data, but extrapolation from primary data and working with your auditor to discuss the level of extrapolation needed is the best process forward there, in my opinion.
Yeah, this is an adjacent answer, but a lot of companies, if they need to publish in Q1, will estimate some Q4 data. That's incredibly common. In fact, if you're on a tight timeline there, one of the ways that work can carry over year is by comparing your estimates to last year's actuals. Now that you might actually have them published, so it's all about just building confidence and trust and documenting with your assurance provider. As we've emphasized throughout, it is that collaborative relationship. They're the third party, of course yourself, ideally a second party like Green Project to help you through that process, make sure that it's as smooth as possible. If that's a question that you'd like to discuss with our team, more than happy to schedule some one-on-one time to dig in more detail. Okay. That was a great set of questions. I think we are mostly wrapped answering them. If there's anything that we missed, as I said, like drop us a line. Also, we really welcome feedback. So if this was useful for you, that's great to know. If you think we flubbed it, also feel free to let us know if there's any webinar topics that you'd like to see in the future or topics that are top of mind for you. Then again, let us know. More feedback, the better. But thank you all for carving out time on your Tuesday to join this webinar, wherever in the world you may be. I know we have people from all around. This has been really fun for us and hopefully educational. So we will call it a day there. But wanted to thank everyone again for your time and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you very much, everyone.